Our next speaker is Oliver James. He's a child clinical psychologist, and he's an author, and he's a Guardian columnist, but he wrote a book called Affluenza, which I just loved. I thought it was great, and I understood why it was a bestseller. Oliver.
Well, fantastic. There are so many people who turned out who feel strongly about this cause. Very interesting summary. I'm ashamed I didn't know that bit of history. And then you listen to what Claire says, and it's really worth reading closely the briefing notes, because if you wanted evidence of what I've long believed, that we do live in a sick, mad society, which, if you were well adjusted to this society, you would be asking to be mentally ill. And I mean, I can't say that I find any of the material in the bill at all surprising. I've had a little bit to do with James Purnell. He would be just as happy being in the Tories as in Labour. I can't see any difference between him and a Tory. And I don't think he knows anything about the things that he's in charge of. And it's just so typical of the crackpot society we live in that somebody like him would be allowed to do this for his own ludicrous reason. I'll come back to that. As you mentioned, Summer, I take the view that we place far too high a value on money, possessions, appearances and fame. We're too materialistic. There is a huge amount of evidence that people who place too high a value on those things are much more at risk of mental illness. As a result, I think that it goes to the heart of what James Purnell is trying to do. He's trying to create a large, vulnerable workforce, and a huge amount of what's passed for feminism has simply consisted of creating a vast, ununionised workforce that Tesco's can exploit. But I think that also, of course, the massive increase that's occurred in mental illness since the introduction of Thatcherism, neoliberalism, what I call selfish capitalism in the last 30 years, is also to do with what's gone on between parents and children, with the meeting of the needs of children. So we are twice as likely to be mentally ill in the English-speaking world compared with mainland continental Europe. You cannot examine that statistic often enough. It's an astounding fact, and it is a fact. Nobody has ever challenged me on that. The World Health Organization evidence clearly shows that the average for the 5 English-speaking nations, US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, is 23% of people who suffered mental illness in the last 12 months. For every one of those, there's another on the verge there. Where compared with only 11.5% average in continental mainland Europe, and that includes the French, who are particularly bonkers. I love the French, I love France, but 18% of them have suffered of mental illness in the last 12 months, and in fact they have a rather unattractive attitude, in my view, to looking after the meeting the needs of small children, but we needn't go into that. Because, of course, the fundamental point, presumably that would unite all of us here tonight, is that the kind of care that a baby receives, well, it starts in pregnancy, starts with, if you have a high stress levels in the last trimester, the last 3 months of your pregnancy, you are much more likely to have high cortisol, which goes into your baby, which makes you much more likely to have a 7, 9, 10-year-old who's got ADHD, who's got all kinds of problems. So it starts there. I mean, in a sane society, for a start, women, we'd be falling over backwards to try and ensure that pregnant women were not stressed in the last 3 months, which wouldn't necessarily mean they didn't work. I mean, some women actually would get stressed if they didn't work, but quite a lot of women would probably prefer not to be working during that time. So it starts there. Then obviously, I'm not going to regale you with all the scientific evidence. God, it would take all night. But there is a massive body of scientific evidence that what happens between the main carer and an infant is critical for setting the thermostat, the electrochemical thermostat of it, to which it returns when nothing else is going on. That's the basic place that you're at, a calm place, an unhappy place, a distressed place, or not. And obviously, you'll all be well aware of the amount of problems that are created for toddlers if the care they're receiving is inconsistent or unresponsive, that is a critical issue as it relates to the bill. And so on and so on and so forth. And I don't think I need to labour this point. Hopefully, many of you have read Sue Gerhardt's book, Why Love Matters. There are many books on this subject which present it. Now, that is the core of the thing, because then you come to cross-national comparisons of how mentally healthy children are. We come to that very unfortunate for the government UNICEF study, which showed that we were bottom of the league table, with America just there of 23 developed nations. We were doing appallingly badly in terms of our children. This was after, well, at least 10 years of a Labour government. And what's more, the more recent evidence from Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett in the Spirit level, they've looked at that UNICEF study and looked at it in terms of how much money is spent by a nation on on parental allowances, how much money is thrown at trying to help parents to meet the needs of their children rather than separate them from their children. And it turns out that actually the UNICEF data makes perfect sense in terms of that the less money that's spent, the more mentally ill the children. I mean, it's true that British culture has always been a bit of an anti-meeting the needs of children kind of culture, but my God, New Labour has been disappointing in this regard. And I mean, again, this is a subject you could talk about for a very long time, but I would start with Sure Start. To me, Sure Start started, and I know exactly what they had in mind originally, but it very quickly turned into a deformed, horrible parody of what it was originally intended to be, and basically turned into just a sort of glorified daycare, instead of supporting parents. And the original research in America that ultimately is the justification for Sure Start scientifically was the high scope study. But the whole point about the high scope study was that they didn't rip the children away from the parents as young as possible. On the contrary, what they did was throw absolutely everything, including the kitchen sink, at trying to enable the parents to meet the needs of the children. And that's why it was so successful. Let's say for every $1 spent, 7 were saved down the line. That's the line. Sure Start, that's not going to be the base. Look at the results. Jay Belsky keeps churning out the results, and Sure Start is actually, not helping at all. And what was all this about? Well, this is this astonishing thing of, basically paying, getting parents into badly paid jobs, getting them away from their children, leaving them to be cared for often badly because understaffed, because not trained, etc. And anyway, I think it's very questionable whether daycare can be made to work personally, but it could certainly be better or worse. And they're being cared for mostly quite badly by badly paid other women who are very often mothers themselves, and they've had to leave their kids to be cared for by strangers. To be paid, there's an astonishing circle there, which just ends up with a lot of very stressed out women who are worried about the welfare of their children, a lot of very unhappy toddlers, and absolutely no winners except Tesco's.